What is the worst canopy malfunction that you could have? Double canopy out. Well, it is my worst malfunction to have because you don't know what to do in that situation. So in this video, let's talk about why it happens, how to manage the situation when you get one, and how to avoid them. What's up, Skydivers? It's Catherine from Skydive Vibes, always sharing the passion of skydiving and helping you become better and safer skydivers. So if you're new here, consider subscribing not to miss our weekly videos all about skydiving. So in this video, I wanted to talk about a specific malfunction that we call having double canopy out. This is when both your main canopy and your reserve canopy are out above your head. They can be flying in different configuration, flying together or in the opposite direction. So that situation can become tricky very fast. Before I start with the video, make sure to check down the description to get links and more information about the resources that I've used to create that video. But not only that, I have a big advice for you. So all that we'll discuss in this video should also be discussed with a coach or an instructor on your own drop zone. My goal is to open the discussion so that you start talking about it, thinking about it, and be ready to react. Now that being out of the way, let's dive in. So first, how can you end up being in a situation of having two canopies above your head? The first cause might be because your reserve closing pin did get dislodged. This could happen by a collision with the door in the plane or during the free fall, having a collision with someone, and the reserve pin would actually wait until you deploy your main canopy to start to deploy. But it can also be because you didn't do a proper gear check. And you gotta do those gear checks 3 times for every jump. Before putting your equipment on, before boarding the plane, and before exiting. This way we're covering those cases where the reserve pin might have been dislodged, but you end up exiting the plane anyway, so doing proper gear checks avoids a good portion of those situations. The next reason is because of an AED activation. This situation may happen if you end up deploying your main canopy too low and too near from the fire altitude of your AED. Your AED may also activate if you're doing hard spiraling or maneuvers under canopy. And another reason why your AED may not activate at the right time is because the settings of your unit might be off depending on the type of jump you're doing. Now, I did a video previously talking about AED settings and you can watch it by clicking right here. And the last reason why you could end up having two canopies above your head is if you have a pilot chute in tow. So this is when your pilot chute is trailing behind after your main canopy deployment and that your main doesn't seem to deploy. Well, at that point you might do your emergency procedures. That's good, but you have a reserve canopy deployed or deploying, and then your main canopy decides to react and deploy itself. That is how you can end up with two canopies above your head. When you have two canopies out, I was able to track 5 different configurations that they may end up in. According to a research made by Performance Designs that you can find linked in the description below, the most likely configuration is the biplane. This is when your main canopy and your reserve canopy are flying in the same direction and that they are one behind the other. The next most common configuration is having both canopies side by side with their end cells touching. Usually the main risers are behind the reserve risers. Another pretty common situation is where you have a fully inflated canopy, but one that is not. So having a trailing pilot chute or with the D-bag, or even having a non-inflated canopy trailing behind. This situation left unattended may remain just like that, but the full deployment of the trailing canopy may happen and you would end up with two canopies fully inflated in some type of configuration. A less frequent situation is the downplane. And I must say that's a scary one. That is when both canopies are working against each other and that end up putting you in a fast spiral down to earth. And lastly, another infrequent situation is having a main and reserve canopy entanglement. So to recap, we have 5 possible situations: the biplane, the side-by-side, having one canopy partially deployed, the downplane, and the entanglement. Good, so you're following me? make sure to give this video a like because we are diving into how to manage those situations. As I was doing my research on this video, I noticed that depending on the association, the manufacturer, I had some opposite recommendations. So I did my best to gather all of them and try to get some logic in behind that in what I'm gonna share with you, but do not take my word for granted. Discuss that with a coach or an instructor, just like I told you before. So first, anytime you will actually have two canopies out, one of the first steps you're flying stable is to take a look at your risers to see if there's any entanglement. This way you'll be able to adjust your thinking and your reaction to avoid getting in a worst situation. So make sure to look at your lines, your risers, and make sure that you can assess if there is an entanglement or not. You always want to steer the best looking canopy. This means no visible entanglements or line twists. Another thing to consider is that you don't want to steer the system with the 4 toggles. This was tested actually, and the canopies ended up fighting against each other, so you don't want that. First, let's talk about the biplane. So like we said, the biplane is when we have 2 canopies flying one behind the other. And one thing you must know is that the rear canopy actually locks in the front canopy lines. This is why you never want to cut away in that configuration. If you realize that your canopy lines or your risers are entangled, or if you are below 1,000 feet and you got to react fast, or just if you're unsure, well, try to steer the front canopy very gently with its rear risers. Having canopies of similar size will make them fly compatibly, and you'll see that a biplane is easily manageable. At any time, of course, you want to prevent any possible downplane. And we're gonna talk about that later, but that's one of the worst situations you could end up in. If your canopies are flying well together, really, my own opinion is that do not try to do anything, try to change the configuration, to try a cutaway, because they're flying well together. You have a lot of fabric above your head, slowing down your descent a lot, and it's been proven that a biplane is very stable and easily landable. And one thing you are sure of right now is that you have a lot of fabric above your head that is flying well. According to Performance Design, if you have directional control, you may want to release the brake of the front canopy and lightly direct your configuration where you want to go. But you'll want to leave the toggles stowed on the rear canopy. And the main reason is that by unstowing the brakes, the canopy will fly faster. So you don't want your rear canopy to fly into the one in front. So by releasing the front canopy toggles, what will happen is that yes, it will have more velocity, but for a canopy, flying with the toggle stowed means that it's nearer from its stalling point at any time. So by unstowing the toggle of the canopy you're gonna direct, you're getting away from the stalling point. When it's time for landing, do not flare. You have a lot of fabric above your head, the configuration is flying pretty flat, so you don't want to give any inputs and prepare for a PLF. The next configuration we'll talk about is the side-by-side configuration. So again, depending on the source of the information, the opinions did differ a bit. Some say that if you have a side-by-side configuration and no entanglements, it could be doable to actually cut away the main canopy. So that's one recommendation. Another one was recommending not to cut away because if you didn't notice a specific entanglement, you could end up in a worse situation. In my own opinion, and what I think I would do is, considering that I have a lot of fabric above my head, I won't try to mess around with it. With a side-by-side configuration, I wouldn't cut away my main canopy because what I know right now is that it's flying together and I have a lot of fabric above my head. Good enough for me. Now I gotta be careful about what I do with it. As I said earlier, one of the first thing you want to do is check if there is any entanglements, because that could affect your decision later on. Again, talking about releasing the brakes, you could release the brake of the dominant canopy to help you a little bit to steer it, but you could also leave all the toggled stowed and simply steer with the rear risers of the canopy. If you end up having already unstowed your main brakes and you got a reserve deployment, try to fly it half brake to slow it down so that both canopies are flying the same speed. If you want to move the system, one thing to consider is that you never want to pull on a canopy. Why? Because by separating your canopies, you may end up in a downplane situation. So what you want to do, you always want to push against the other canopy. So that also means that at any point, you want to keep the canopies together. So if you are in a situation where you have line twist on one canopy or both, the canopies might want to get away from each other. So your role is to try to keep them together as much as possible. So if the system flies well and you can control it by light inputs on the rear risers, that's fine, you can land it. But if the configuration seems uncontrollable, at that point and at that point only, you may start to think about cutting away the main canopy. That's a last resort if you doubt that the system can make you land safely. Talking about landing, again, you don't want to flare. Try to steer yourself facing the wind and prepare for a PLF. The next configuration is if you have a partially deployed canopy. It could either be the main canopy that is not deployed yet or the reserve canopy. Knowing that you have a partially deployed canopy, you want to keep your speed slow. This way you will reduce the chance of having a deployment due to the wind speed. So keep the brakes stowed. If they are already released, make sure to fly half brake to avoid speed. If you are in a situation where your main canopy is not deployed yet, you will have the opportunity to cut away your main canopy. Before doing so, you want to make sure to remove your RSL so that it doesn't interfere with anything. Then you want to cut away your main, and you also want to make sure that you release all the main canopy risers and let the system go away or trail behind you. If the second canopy starts to inflate itself, well, let it inflate and position itself in one of the configuration we talked about. If it's the reserve canopy that it's not deployed yet, you want to slowly grab the line and the deployment bag and try to contain the deployment of the system. Do that slowly, not to activate the deployment, and you can stuff all the system in between your knees. So that's one of the recommendations. However, the research from Performance Designs told them that having a system that it's not deployed may be dangerous if it decides to get inflated during your landing or at a very low altitude. This actually happened and a skydiver got injured. So from their recommendation, if you have a reserve canopy that is in a stage of deployment or started to inflate it, you might want to aid it to deploy. And then you can assist the deployment to avoid any entanglement and let the reserve canopy end up in a configuration with the main canopy. Of course, all the situations are different. I'm not giving you the only truth, but this video is to help you think about those possible situations and try to get prepared for them. The next configuration is one that we've talked about earlier, and it's one of the worst situations you may end up with having two canopies out, and it's the downplane. Why it's one of the worst? Because having a downplane configuration, meaning one canopy both sides and trying to get away from each other, this will put you into a spiral that goes very fast down towards the earth. And this happens because one of the canopies or both may have line twists. So needless to say that in this situation, you gotta act fast. So if you have enough altitude, try to assess the situation and check if there is any hard entanglement in between the canopies. If not, you can cut away your main canopy right away. If you can think of it, release your RSL first and then cut away your main canopy. Then you will have to work on your reserve canopy to remove any line twists. If you actually see that there's big entanglements in between the canopies, you might want to try to fix the situation and try to bring the canopies back together. So use the rear risers to try to make the canopy stop spinning and go together, but of course, in last resort, cut away your main canopy. So the last configuration I wanted to talk about is if you have a case of entanglement in between the reserve and main canopy. You will have to do whatever possible to try to clear the canopies. You can use the risers, even the toggles to help you, but you really want to get rid of that entanglement enough so that you can cut away your main canopy. But be careful not to cut away your main canopy before trying to assess the entanglement, because cutting it away may accentuate the problem. Of course, the best way to manage a situation where you have two canopies out is to actually avoid it first. So now let's talk about how to actually avoid ending up in a double canopy out situation. First, you want to keep a good altitude awareness throughout all of your jump. You can also get help from devices like an audible altimeter and of course your visual altimeter. Next, you also want to of course respect the deployment altitude. By always pushing the limit of your deployment altitude, you may end up in the limit of your AED fire altitude. You also want to make sure to initiate your emergency procedures by 2,500 feet. This is what we also call the decision altitude. This way you're making sure you're performing your emergency procedures, again, away from the setting of your AED. Talking about AEDs, you want to use an AED that is properly maintained and that has the right settings for your jump. Next, you want to fly your parachute conservatively below 1,500 feet. Again, to avoid an AED fire. You want to keep your equipment well maintained, and you want to do your gear checks properly, of course. And the last element that I would add is to always keep a hook knife on your equipment. That's something that I want to talk about in another video as well. But I've seen situations where having a hook knife could have simplified the situation a lot. Especially when you have one good canopy above your head and the other one messing around with it. And in those situations, having a hook knife and use it properly could have simplified everything and helped them get away without any injuries. Now it's your time to let me know in the comment section if you did have any malfunction up to now. I hope not. And if you did actually end up in a double canopy out situation. And we're done! So if you want to watch other videos from Skydive Vibes, simply click here. And on that, as usual, keep jumping, stay safe, and blue skies!